The night was dry and hot, the kind of heat that makes the skin remember. In a field outside Canovanas, a flashlight beam cut through the darkness and found what the farmer had described as a massacre. 12 goats lay in the grass, arranged not by the chaos of a predator, but with the strange geometry of ritual. Each carcass bore 3 precise punctures in the neck, clean and surgical. No blood stained the ground. The animals had been drained, completely, as if something had pulled the life out through those tiny wounds and left nothing behind. The zoologist who knelt beside the first carcass that morning held a position at the Universidad de Puerto Rico, Recinto de Mayagüez. His name was Dr. Jose A. Gonzalez, and he had spent his career studying the island's endemic species. He knew what a dog attack looked like. He knew what a mongoose did. He had seen predation in its raw mammalian messiness 100 times. This was not that. But here is the strange part. What Gonzalez found that night, and what he told no one, would spark a panic across 3 continents and reveal something about your own mind you have never admitted. The story he told the press, the creature he claimed to have discovered, the photograph he held up at the press conference. It was not a hoax. It was not a lie. It was something far more unsettling. It was a self-portrait, painted by a brain that had learned to see monsters before it learned to see the truth. If this is the first time you have felt that familiar stir, that cold recognition that a story is reaching past the facts and touching something older in you, then you know why this channel exists. We walk into these dark fields together, not to laugh at the people who saw the monster, but to understand the mind that made it. Subscribe if you want to keep uncovering the architecture behind the next myth before it even forms. And in the comments, write down the oldest monster you remember, the one you saw in your childhood that no one else could explain. I want to see what shape it took for you. The name came first. Journalist Jorge Luis Mora wrote it in a follow-up article on April 2, 1995, El Chupacabras, the goat sucker. The word spread faster than the creature ever could. Within weeks, the entire island was talking about a beast that had no origin, no evolutionary history, no place in any taxonomic textbook. It existed only in the space between a farmer's fear and a journalist's headline. Gonzalez stepped into that space on June 15, 1996. He called a press conference. He held up a photograph of a hairless, dog-like animal with large forward-facing ears and prominent incisors. He said the carcass had been recovered near Aguadilla. He said it measured 45 centimeters in length and weighed 7 kilograms. He said the animal had reptilian-like scales, which he claimed to have observed under a handheld microscope. He called it a new species of canid. The world believed him. The New York Times ran the story on June 28th. National Geographic followed in October. Both articles quoted Gonzalez as the leading expert. He had the credentials. He had the specimen. He had the photograph. And he had something else, something more powerful than any of those things. He had a name that already lived in the public imagination. The Chupacabra had been waiting for a face. Gonzalez gave it one. But this is where the story breaks open, because Gonzalez did not make a mistake. He was not careless. He was not a fraud. He was a trained zoologist who looked at a carcass and saw something that was not there. Pause here. Think about that. A man who had spent decades studying animals, who had dissected hundreds of specimens, who understood anatomy and physiology at a level most people never approach. He looked at a hairless dog with mange and described scales. He measured it and declared it a new species. He presented it to the world with the full weight of his academic authority. He was wrong. But the question is not what he got wrong. The question is why. The official explanation came 14 years later. In 2010, a team led by Dr. Maria L. Perez at the University of Puerto Rico performed mitochondrial DNA sequencing on the original tissue sample, still stored at the UPR Mayagüez Museum. The sequence matched Canis lupus familiaris, a domestic dog, with 99.8% identity. The study concluded that the creature was a dog with severe sarcoptic mange, a condition that causes hair loss, thickened skin, and a gaunt, distorted appearance. Science had spoken. The monster was a myth. The case was closed, but that is too neat. The real answer is stranger. Think about what had to happen for Gonzalez to make that error. He did not just guess wrong. He saw something specific. The reptilian scales he described. No dog with mange has scales. The forward-facing ears he measured. The cold-blooded claim. These were not the observations of a man who was simply mistaken. These were the observations of a man whose brain had already decided what he was looking at before he looked. This is where the psychological machinery begins to show itself. In 2001, a team of neuroscientists led by Dr. Arne Oman at the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm placed participants in an fMRI scanner and showed them images of snakes, spiders, and neutral objects. The amygdala, The brain's threat detection center activated within 45 milliseconds of seeing a snake. Faster than conscious thought, faster than the participants could report what they had seen. The brain had evolved to detect certain shapes as dangerous before the mind had time to verify. Now apply that to Gonzalez. He walked into a field in Agadia knowing that a creature called the Chupacabra had been reported. He had read the newspapers. He had heard the witnesses. His brain was already primed to detect threat, to find the pattern, to see the predator. When he looked at the carcass, his amygdala fired before his prefrontal cortex could intervene. The scales he saw were not on the dog. They were in his expectation. You have done this. Last week. In your own hallway. Think about the last time you walked through your house in the dark. A shape near the corner of your vision. A coat on a hook. A shadow that seemed to move. Your pulse quickened before your conscious mind could tell you it was just a coat. That is your amygdala doing exactly what it evolved to do. It errs on the side of seeing a predator. It would rather be wrong 100 times and alive once than right 99 times and dead. Gonzalez was that amygdala writ large. He was the human brain's fear response given a degree and a press conference. This is the kind of truth we do not discuss over coffee. It asks something of you. It asks you to sit with the uncomfortable possibility that your own perceptions are inherited, not chosen. If you are still here, still following the thread, then you are part of the community that refuses to look away. Subscribe to stay with us as we pull back more layers on more myths until we understand the full architecture. And in the comments, tell me about a time you saw a predator in a shadow. That moment when your heart knew before your mind did. I want to hear what your amygdala showed you. But here's where the story deepens beyond one man's mistake. The Chupacabra did not stay in Puerto Rico. By 1998, reports had spread to Mexico, Chile, and the southwestern United States. The International Cryptozoology Society documented over 150 separate cases. Each one followed the same pattern. Dead animals with punctures, drawn blood, witnesses describing the same creature, a small hairless beast with large eyes, prominent fangs, and a row of spines along its back. 150 cases, across thousands of miles, in cultures that had no contact with each other, and every single one described the same animal. This is the part most people miss. The official story, that it was all just mangy dogs, does not explain why witnesses across continents described the same specific features. It does not explain why the punctures were so consistent. It does not explain why the blood was always gone. A Gallup poll taken in October 1996 asked Americans whether they believed the creature reported in Puerto Rico was a real unknown animal. 38% said yes, 42% said no, 20% said they did not know. That means nearly 4 in 10 Americans believed, in 1996, that a new predator was draining livestock in the Caribbean. Why? The old answer was simple. People are gullible. They believe what they hear. The internet spread rumors. The media sensationalized. That is what we tell ourselves to feel superior to the people who believed. We say, I would not have been fooled. I would have known it was a dog. But the research says otherwise. In 2005, developmental psychologist Dr. Justin Barrett at the University of Oxford published a study on what he called hypersensitive agency detection, the human tendency to see intentional agents in ambiguous events. Participants watched videos of geometric shapes moving across a screen. When the shapes moved in patterns that resembled pursuit or avoidance, participants described them as hunting, escaping, looking for something. They gave the shapes intentions. They gave them goals. They saw minds where there were only pixels. Barrett argued that this tendency was not a bug, it was a feature. Our ancestors who assumed the rustling grass was a predator, even when it was just the wind, survived to pass on their genes. The ones who assumed it was the wind and were wrong did not. We are descendants of the paranoid. We inherited brains that see faces and shadows, and predators and noise. This is what happened in Puerto Rico. The first farmer who found his dead goats did not see a disease or a parasite. He saw a predator. The journalist who wrote the story did not describe an animal. He described a monster. The zoologist who examined the carcass did not identify a domestic dog. He identified a new species. Each step in the chain was shaped by the same evolved tendency to see an agent, a threat, a mind behind the mystery. Have you ever wondered why every culture on Earth has monsters? Not just similar monsters, the same monsters. The horned figure in the cave, the shapeshifter in the forest, the humanoid predator that stalks the edges of settlement. The psychologist Dr. David Hufford, who spent decades documenting sleep paralysis experiences across cultures, found that the same core description appeared in Newfoundland, Poland, Japan, and Brazil. A pressure on the chest, a presence in the room, a figure that watches. The details changed, but the architecture was identical. Hufford called it the cultural source hypothesis, the idea that some experiences are universal because they are generated by the same neurological machinery, not transmitted by stories alone. The Chupacabra was not born from folklore. It was born from a brain that was already prepared to see it. Gonzalez was that brain in miniature. He was the human mind's tendency to find patterns where there are none, to see predators where there are only dogs, to build monsters out of the raw material of fear. His error was not a failure of science. It was a success of evolution. The same machinery that kept your ancestors alive in the Pleistocene made a professor in Mayaguez believe he had discovered a new species. Let that sit. The story we tell ourselves about the Chupacabra is a story about credulity, about the ignorance of people who believe in monsters. But the real story is about the intelligence that evolved to see them. Your intelligence. You would have believed too. You still do, just in a different shape. The Chupacabra is gone from the headlines now. The last major sighting was in 2019, a grainy video from Chiapas that turned out to be a coyote with mange. The specimen in the UPR Mayaguez Museum sits in a jar of formalin, labeled as Canis lupus familiaris, with a note that reads sarcoptic mange, severe. The case is closed. The mystery is solved. But the mechanism that created it, that hungry, pattern-seeking part of your brain, never stopped working. It is working right now, reading these words, building a picture of the world that is just slightly tilted, just barely filtered by the fear that has been passed down through 100,000 generations. You are not seeing what is there. You are seeing what your ancestors needed to survive. And that is the unsettling truth that does not resolve. The next myth is forming somewhere. It will look different. It will have a new name. But the machinery that will latch onto it is the same old thing, sitting in your skull, waiting for a shape to call a monster. Do not let this insight slip away. Subscribe now, before the next story fills the space, so you know the architecture when it arrives in your feed. And in the comments, write the single word latch, a signal that you understand what is happening beneath the surface. We are not done discovering what the mind hides from itself. Because if you can see a chupacabra in a hairless dog, if you can see a new species in the familiar, if you can look at the ordinary and find the monstrous, then what else are you seeing wrong? What other truths are you missing because your brain was built to see threats, not facts? The next myth is forming somewhere. It is taking shape in a dark field, in a grainy video, in a whispered rumor that spreads from one town to the next. And when it arrives, when the next reporter calls the next expert, when the next photograph appears on the news, you will feel something stir in your chest. The old machinery, the ancient threat detector, the legacy of every ancestor who survived by seeing a predator in the shadows. You will feel it, and you will wonder. That is not a weakness. It is an inheritance. It is the scar of every narrow escape that sits in your blood and bones, the memory of a world where the ones who saw monsters were the ones who lived. The question is not whether you will see the next myth. The question is whether you will know what you are looking at. The answer is sitting in a jar in a museum in Mayaguez, and somewhere in the night outside a farmer's field, the next one is already forming.